Zimmerman has been associated intimately with neurosurgery for many years. And I've been a friend of Dr. Harvey Cushing, the founder of our organization, that subsequently performed the autopsy on Dr. Cushing. And it's largely because of his intimate knowledge of neurosurgery as it's developed in the United States, as well as his friendships with many of the original neurologists and neurosurgeons in this country that has led to this interview being done. Harry, I thought I would begin by asking you something about your medical school. Can you recall when it was that you decided to even become a doctor?
Yes, I vividly recall, because I was called in by the dean of the freshman class at Yale, Professor Einstein, who was a professor of psychology at Yale, who wanted to know on whose authority I had taken so many courses in 1 year at the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale. And my response to that was that in the first year of my medical school enrollment at Yale, I decided to switch courses from preparing for a career in law to that of medicine, and I found that I didn't have enough sciences to permit me to get into a medical school. So without authorization, I enrolled in a number of mathematics courses and biology and botany course and comparative physiology, and was carrying a load which Professor Einstein told me was really for 2 years' work in 1 year. And my response to that was that I would drop it on condition that I wasn't passing any of the courses, whereupon he quickly looked at my record and said, well, I guess you got me there because you're doing well in all the courses, so as long as you continue doing well, we'll let you do it. So it was in the first year of college that I really decided to switch to medicine.
You remember any influence at
Yes, I had a friend in high school who preceded me by 2 years, who apparently all his life had planned to study medicine. And he showed me dissections that he was doing on mice and rats and cats, and I got interested in the precision with which he took out such organs as the heart from these small rodents, and told me how they were functioning, and that interested me.
I see. You completed medical school at Yale?
I completed both college and medical school at Yale, yes.
And your internship?
My internship at the New Haven Hospital.
And did you commence your residency in pathology there?
Yes, I commenced a residency in pathology because I felt I needed some background in pathology in order to continue in internal medicine, which was my intention all through medical school. And then I was enticed by the dean of the medical school, Dr. Wintnitz, who was also the chairman of the Department of Pathology, to linger on, so to speak, in pathology. From year to year, he induced me to stay on, and gradually I gave up the idea of doing internal medicine and remained in pathology.
I suppose the idea of the integration of pathology with internal medicine and all the clinical disciplines arose from Sir William Osler's influence in American medicine.
In great measure, that's true.
Was that customary in those days for most internists to do that, or surgeons?
Many people had done it. Even the people who worked with Osler in previous years had spent 1 or more years working with Popsy Welch, the pathologist at Johns Hopkins, or going somewhere else to pick up a year or more of training in pathology. And some of the best teachers we had at the Yale Medical School, like George Bloomer, as an example, was an accomplished pathologist, even though he was the leading internist on the Yale Medical School faculty and the leading internist in New Haven.
Now, you mentioned that the end of your first year, towards the end of your first year, the head of pathology sort of twisted your arm to remain in pathology.
That is right. Witnitz decided early on, as when I was still a medical student, that I ought to remain in pathology, and he used various devices to entangle me into the department by making certain offers that I couldn't resist. For example, he awarded me the Charles Linnaeus Ives Fellowship in my second year in pathology, which was a prestigious thing to get for a medical student just out of medical school. And then when I decided to start my training in internal medicine, and I had approached the chairman of the Department of Internal Medicine, Dr. Blake, Francis Blake, who said he would take me on as an intern and a resident in internal medicine. Witnitz said, we will send you abroad to study neuropathology for a year or two on condition that you come back and spend an equal length of time in the Department of Pathology.
Now, Dr. Winternetz had been the one to propose that you go into neuropathology?
He was the one that proposed I go into neuropathology, probably out of desperation. He decided that a medical school in America ought to have a department of neuropathology. None at that time had. In 1920, 1930, there was no medical school in America with a full-time staff and a full-time department of neuropathology. So he looked around trying to find someone in this country whom he could appoint to the faculty to teach neuropathology. And indeed there was no one, because the few neuropathologists in this country available at the time had gotten their training abroad, were clinicians, either neurologists or psychiatrists, and were doing neuropathology on a part-time hobby basis. For example, George Hassan, who later became a very good friend of mine, really made part of his livelihood by seeing patients privately. And the same was true for Arthur Weil at Northwestern University. Nathaniel Winkleman in Philadelphia had a private office and did most of his work in clinical neurology. So that ultimately Witnitz came to the idea that if we wanted a neuropathologist, he had to get somebody that would train for that specialty and then would come to Yale and start a department.
Except for Lorente Donoso and Ramon Cajal, most of the early staining techniques introduced into neuropathology were introduced by those clinical neurologists and psychiatrists, were they not?
That is right. Even Wilder Penfield, for example,
Yes.
who wanted to learn a little neuropathology in his work on gliomas, went to Cajal and to Ortega and picked up the silver and gold chloride techniques, which he brought back to the Presbyterian Hospital, to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and became an expert simply because he had no competition really from any neuropathologist.
Yes.
And people who wanted to learn the impregnation method for the study of glia all flocked to Wilder Penfield at the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Columbia University.
That was prior to his going to Montreal then. I didn't realize
Oh,
that.
yes, prior to his going to Montreal.
When you had decided on Munich, that was sponsored by this fellowship you received.
No, I was asked by Witnitz to learn neuropathology sufficiently so I could teach the course at Yale.
I see.
And I looked around and found there was no place in the United States at that time where I could go to an established department and devote a year or two to learning neuropathology. So my alternative then was to go abroad, and I told Witnitz that I couldn't do it in the United States. He said, well, we're perfectly willing to send you abroad. We'll give you the fellowship. We'll give you sufficient money for your expenses and your travel, and you pick out where you want to study abroad. So I made a hurried survey of what was available and found that I could either go to Ortega and Cajal in Madrid, or to the Forts in Berlin, or to Jakob in Hamburg, or to Spielmeyer in Munich. And I picked Spielmeyer, which, by the way, turned out to be a very fortunate decision that I had made at the time without knowing, really, because Spielmeyer and I became fast friends, and much of what I had accomplished in neuropathology since stemmed from the influence that I received from Spielmeyer.
In the entranceway of the Institute in Munich, there's a large bust of Emil Kraepelin, who served as the founder of the Institute. But
That is right.
it mainly was a psychiatric origin as an institute for the investigation of mental illness, was it not?
Kraepelin was a psychiatrist.
Yes.
But he was an unusual man in addition, because he believed that psychiatry must be based upon organic derangements of the nervous system. And he already knew, perhaps even emphasized it to excess, that extraneous agents like alcohol might damage the brain. So he wanted somebody who was expert in not only psychiatric diagnoses, but who was expert in physiology and in the bacteriology and in pathology. And he picked people like Spielmeyer and Spielmeyer's predecessors, Nissl and Alzheimer, to work in neuropathology. And Spielmeyer was one of several people who had worked at the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt, where I went in Munich to study with Spielmeyer neuropathology.
Incidentally, what was the environment like in Munich in 1929, 1930, as you can recall today, compared to the events following that?
In Munich, in those years, there was what the Germans called Gemütlichkeit, a charmed, pleasant life, from painting to music to daily life. It was a lovely city with the center of art, many museums, much music, surrounded by the Bavarian countryside with the Herrenchiemsee and the nearby Bavarian Alps. It was lovely and charming, and many people were welcomed from different countries abroad to come and work. In neuropathology, for example, I found Adam Opalski from Warsaw. He later became chairman of the Department of Neurology at Warsaw University. I found Ko Hirasawa, who came from Japan, and he later became president of Kyoto University. To this day, some 55 years later, Ko Hirasawa and I are still fast friends, and we see each other every 2 or 3 years. Either he comes to America or I go to Japan, and we keep in touch. So that it was a very charming life that one led in Munich at the time. But rumblings of things that were eventually to flood the country and to devastate many lives in Germany were already beginning to appear. In 1929, we began to hear about the Hitler Putsch, and we began to hear about the parades of the Nazis, the brown shirts at that time. There was a play that was called Das Grabmal des unbekannten Soldaten, the grave of the unknown soldier, which tended to blame the military clique in Germany for the First World War. that was raided by a bunch of the brown shirts, and they threatened the lives of the performers and ruined the theater so that the play couldn't go on. This began as rumbles, but by 1929, 1930, when I was there, things were still quiet.
It was sort of the interval between the original Hitler attempt to take over power and his release from prison, and then his gradual build-up of power to become chancellor, 1932.
That is right, and you remember
January
that
33.
his base of operations was really Munich originally. That's where he got started.
Yeah.
That's right.
But in your completion of the residency in, or rather the year of research in Munich, was followed by your return to Yale then.
That is right.
1930.
That's right.
And then you mentioned that Professor Spielmeyer came over later that year to assist in establishing your lab.
Quite.
By that time, I suppose that must have been the first department or section of truly organized neuropathology in the United States.
That is right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, a full-time department.
Mm-hmm.
The course in neuropathology became part of the curriculum of the medical school, part of the course in general pathology. And since I taught both general and neuropathology, it was a very easy transition from my lecture on the liver one day and perhaps on diseases of the nervous system a week or a month later.
Well, what work were you mainly doing in those early years in neuropathology?
In those early years, we were interested primarily in vitamin deficiency as it affects the nervous system. In beriberi, in the disease that is associated with deprivation of the whole vitamin B complex,
Pellagra,
with pellagra and so on. And that was because at that time at Yale, there were a group of young investigators who were willing to collaborate and work on problems together. For example, when the work on beriberi that I did with vitamin B1, thiamine deficiency, my collaborator was George Cowgill, who was the professor of physiological chemistry at Yale and an expert in vitamin B1 deficiency, and Jim Fox, the neurologist at Yale, who trained our dogs to walk on their hind legs so that when they became deficient in vitamin B1 and developed beriberi, they became ataxic. And Jim Fox did the clinical examinations on these animals, which later I autopsied and removed the peripheral nerves and spinal cord and brain and found what changes would occur. We worked not only on the damage done to the nervous system, but also on the methods of therapy in these. And we found that if we produce beriberi in an animal, and he was quite ataxic from peripheral neuropathy lesions, we could give one injection of beriberi and cure the disease clinically, thiamine, cure the disease clinically by a simple one injection, even though we found that the peripheral nerves still were demyelinated.
In humans, particularly after the war, studying some of the prisoners of war, a number of our soldiers were found to be blind from apparently beriberi, perhaps his multiple B complex deficiency. Yeah. At that time, there was a Rockefeller Foundation study of pellagra in the South, southern United States.
Yes.
Were you involved in any way in that?
I wasn't involved with the study either at the Rockefeller Foundation or the United States Public Health Service that Joseph Goldberger was doing at the time. But we were aware of pellagra. We had produced pellagra in animals. Edward Gilday, who was the psychiatrist at Yale, one of the psychiatrists, was interested in pellagra. He and I made some experiments on pellagra, in animals produced the disease, the dementia, the dermatitis, the diarrhea, and then followed up with showing what the lesions actually histologically could be demonstrated in the brain. We produce Wernicke's encephalitis, for example, with a mixture of multiple vitamin deficiencies, primarily thiamine again. We worked with riboflavin deficiency, with even experiments with deficiency in vitamin D, and then did the reverse by giving excessive amounts of vitamin D, producing damage to the heart and to other organs, and demonstrated not only the clinical symptomatology in these animals, but also the anatomical basis for these symptoms.
I see.
I did this work on hypervitaminosis D with Ethel Burak, who was a protege of Lafayette Mendels, who was chairman of the Department of Physiological Chemistry at Yale at the time.
In other areas of neuroscience in Yale in those early years, when you had returned in pathology, were there other activities going on, for example, in clinical neurology or?
There certainly was. Shortly after I came back to establish, from Europe, to establish the Department of Neuropathology at Yale, we got Dr. William German, pupil of Harvey Cushing's, to come as the assistant professor of neurosurgery at Yale. Already at Yale at that time was the eminent neuroanatomist Harold Burr, Ducet de Beren, the neurophysiologist, and John Fulton, the physiologist, especially neurophysiologist, was there at Yale. Jim Fox was involved in clinical neurology. We formed what was called the Neurological Study Unit, which met every Tuesday from 11 to 12:30 or 1 o'clock in an auditorium, and discussed either experimental neurological problems, or they would bring in interesting clinical diagnostic problems to discuss, or other problems related to neurophysiology. One day, for example, Ducet de Beren would hold forth and tell us about his experiments with strychnine, involvement of the cerebral cortex, how it alters the function of ganglion cells. Another time, Warren McCulloch might tell us about his experiments. Harold Burr always drew diagrams of what fiber tracts were involved in obscure clinical neurological syndromes that Jim Fox would demonstrate. And then we were joined fairly early in 1935 by Harvey Cushing and Louise Eisenhardt, who arrived from Boston and transferred much of their material and most of their slides and anatomical biopsy specimens to Yale when Cushing left Harvard to come to Yale, so that Cushing became an active participant in these neurological studies section, symposia that we conducted weekly.
You mentioned Ducet de Beren. How did he happen to come to the United States at that time, in the early 30s?
It was a very interesting thing. I believe he was associate professor of physiology in his university in Holland. I think it was Leiden, but I'm not absolutely sure. At any rate, he was invited, together with other people, to present addresses for the faculty on original research they were doing. And he had worked for a year preparing experiments for which he would use as his subject matter for the address which might qualify him for the professorship. And to his horror, he discovered that an associate of his used his material to present the same address prior to being called upon to give his talk. And in great disgust, he resigned from the university, and that was John Fulton's opportunity to acquire for Yale an eminent physiologist like Duce de Beren. And Duce de Beren came with his whole family to New Haven, and he became a member of the Yale faculty.
Had Warren McCulloch sort of begun his professional career here at Yale?
He was working as a young man with Duce de Beren in his laboratory. He got much of his training, if not all, in Duce de Beren's laboratory.
And more or less, what do you feel was the greatest achievement of Duce de Beren's work in neurophysiology?
He was interested, at least in the later years of his life, prior to his tragic end, when while giving an address at another medical school, he collapsed on the platform with a coronary attack and died. For years before that, when he was working at in physiology at Yale, and with whom I collaborated on writing several papers, in German, by the way, on physiology of ganglion cells at different parts of the brain, this occupied his major interest. He devised experiments to study the function of the different layers of ganglion cells in the cerebral cortex. Ultimately hoped to do it in man, but the experimental work with which I collaborated with was based on thermocouple coagulation at the measured degree of heat and time through a craniotomy opening wound in the dog cerebral cortex. And by heating the cortex, he could kill off, coagulate the first layer of cells in the cerebral cortex, the second layer, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. And merely by prolonging the duration of the heating, or by increasing the heat of the thermocouple. And then by studying what effects neurologically he could produce in these animals, in the motor cortex, for example, he could tell what the minimal effect was, which would involve the first and perhaps second layer of cortical ganglion cells, and then prolonging the heat so that the third layer was involved. He could tell by the accretion of symptomatology what the function of the various layers was. This was an ingenious method of studying cell function. It was in the days before single microelectrode insertions could be done. That's quite right.
And then his strychnization technique, the application of strychnine to surfaces, limited surfaces of the cortex of the cerebrum, was to study, I suppose, intrahemispheric, interhemispheric connections.
Correct.
And
see, in that too, it was his search for the study of what are different ganglion cells really doing in the nervous system. He was interested in the function.
So at least for the neocortex, the new brain, he was more or less the founder of the research techniques that subsequently refined and further developed by Warren McCulloch, among others.
Quite right.
Many people today.
That's right. In the early experiments at Yale that Duce de Beren carried out, Warren McCulloch was his assistant and associate, as was I. My responsibility in his experiments were merely to demonstrate what the anatomical lesions were, to prove really, visually, which cells in what layers were damaged by the methods that he was employing, which gave him his clinical results.
Yes. Now, in Dr. Fulton's case, who was naturally, we know, an intimate friend of Dr. Cushing for many years, before then even, I had gathered that his interests mainly were in the autonomic mechanisms of the brain.
He was
And-
interested, you remember, John Fulton at the
And
time?
in ventilation, respiratory ventilation.
In the motor function.
Yes, pyramidal tract, so-called.
His experiments at Yale, which I witnessed by watching him operate on chimps and on baboons and on an orangutan once.
The phylogenetic evolution of the motor system.
That is
the
right.
cortical representation of the motor system.
And that was followed by his book on the sign of Babinski,
Yes.
you remember.
Yes.
You will recall the book he wrote on the premotor cortex, which prompted Kinnear Wilson to say it's a bad title because what can be in front of the front?
That was shortly before Kinnear Wilson's death, I think.
That is right.
Yeah, about 1939 or 38, something like that.
Yeah.
But Dr. Fulton had attempted to show that in the higher primates, that there was an increasing cortical regulation of the motor system, and a Babinski response was an indirect indicator of the degree of cortical influence over the so-called pyramidal tract. The year when Dr. Cushing came to settle in New Haven once again, he had attended school there many years before. Did he ever tell you how he had, or why he had decided to relocate and settle, retire in New Haven rather than remaining in Boston?
You're asking about Harvey Cushing?
Yes.
Yes, I discussed that with him any number of times for the following reason. He was a Yale College graduate.
Yes.
So that, like all true Yaleys, he was very much interested in Yale. Not particularly in the medical school, by the way, because in his day, the Yale School of Medicine was a secondary school. It was not among the leading medical schools in the country. Wintnitz was instrumental in putting that in the forefront and making it one of the important medical schools in the country. But in Harvey Cushing's days, when he was an undergraduate in Yale College, the Yale Medical School played a minor role in the university. Nonetheless, he was always interested in Yale. By the way, you know, he was a pitcher on the Yale team that played against Harvard in June of every year. One of the great treats that I used to have was when he would invite me in the spring to accompany him to a Yale-Harvard football game to watch Yale play against Harvard. And he always bought himself and bought me a bag of peanuts. I think they were 10 cents a bag at that time, and he would buy two, give me one, and he would have one, and we would sit and watch the Yale game. It was Wintnitz who got him interested to come back to the medical school. And the reason that that happened is because, as you probably know, he had a fallout with the authorities at the Harvard Medical School.
I thought it was mainly the head of surgery who succeeded him, who had been one of his earlier trainees.
Yes, and he had some problem. And that decided him that he would remove all his specimens with permission from the Harvard authorities, who apparently were glad to get rid of 2,000 brain jars, for example, with specimens. And he got permission to copy all the clinical records, so that when Wintnitz invited him to come to Yale upon his retirement as professor of neurosurgery at the Peter Ben Brigham Hospital, Wintnitz said, "Why don't you come to Yale and we will make you professor of the history of medicine?" And as you know, Cushing had a lifelong interest in historical aspects of medicine, especially neurosurgery, and so he thought that that would be a good idea for him to do. And the only question was, could we also accommodate Louise Eisenhardt? And then I was asked, could we find room for Louise Eisenhardt, and I welcomed the idea. And then Cushing said, will you find room for 2,000 brain jars? And we found room for that. And he said, and some 20 cabinets of clinical charts. And Yale was so interested in getting him to come that they offered him a space even for that.
Were these clinical charts then not on microfilm? They were actually written out by hand?
There was no microfilm at that time. Most of it was copied by hand and photographed. There
Where
were a
are
lot
those
of photographs
records today?
They are
The
at Yale.
In the historical collection? Or?
No, I cannot answer whether they've been moved to the historical.
And the specimens?
Collection. The specimens were in the Department of Pathology. We had a large museum at the time, but since I left Yale, I cannot tell you precisely where the specimens now are. They may still be in the Department of Pathology, or they may have been moved somewhere.
But they wouldn't have been discarded.
Oh, no. No, I'm quite sure they were not discarded.
Did Dr. Eisenhardt work in the Department of Pathology
Yes,
then?
her office was next door to mine. We turned over an office and laboratory to her. She used one of my technicians full-time that I had trained, and we simply got in another young lady to take over. And Louise had the use of a laboratory and an office and a technician and everything that went with it. In part, Dr. Cushing financed, if not her salary, at least the material she was using. He paid for that.
Now, she had been his secretary in years gone by before she went to medical school to become his pathologist.
That's right.
But where had she learned pathology?
Where did she learn pathology? I think she worked with Percival Bailey before he left.
I see.
You see, Bailey.
But she had not trained under a pathologist or with a pathologist?
No, she was primarily a neuropathologist and primarily a neuro-oncologist. Her experience in other than tumors of the nervous system was limited. And her interest was limited. She was primarily interested in the Cushing collection. A more loyal and more competent worker couldn't be found for Dr. Cushing that Louise Eisenhardt represented.
I suppose because of your shared interest in neuropathology and that you would come to know Dr. Cushing very shortly after his arrival there.
Oh, I got to know him on his arrival, really, because one fine day, some 7 huge vans arrived on Cedar Street, carrying all the thousands of records and all the thousands of specimens. He moved everything bodily out of Boston into New Haven, you see.
And that was where he lived in his last years?
He lived in New Haven on Whitney Avenue.
On Whitney Avenue. And you lived on what street?
I lived on Everett Street.
So you backed on each other?
Our backyards were contiguous.
Yes. So he moved his library, I'm sure, entirely to the house.
His private library was moved to his house, yes.
And he was continuing his collecting of books. I think you mentioned one time he had called you over one evening or one afternoon to...
Oh, he did that more than on one occasion. Almost whenever he got a new purchase that was shipped into him of some rare edition or some rare volume, he would call and ask if I had anything to do that evening, and already I was geared to answer no, and he'd say, then come over, I'll show you a new Vesalius I just got, and I would come over. He used to do that very frequently when out-of-town visitors came to him too. He frequently had me in for dinner when he served dinner to one of his guests. I remember on more than one occasion that Ernest Sachs of St. Louis, for example, would come to visit Cushing, and I was frequently a second at the dinner table with Sachs and with Cushing. Mrs. Cushing was away a large part of the time, and partly probably because he was lonely and partly because he was so keyed up about his new bibliographic acquisitions, he would invite a witness to his achievement, and it would turn out to be me because I was
Yes.
available at the time.
Where would Mrs. Cushing be?
Well, she visited with her children, you
Were
see.
they all married by that time?
No, Barbara was not married yet.
And where was
Still a
Barbara?
girl. She was
At
at
home?
school and partly home. I used to see a good bit of Barbara. But the other daughters were married and away from home, and she'd visit with them.
Was it Betsy who married one of the Roosevelts?
Betsy Cushing married Jimmy Roosevelt,
Right.
yes.
And you mentioned one time that President Roosevelt came to New Haven.
Yes, during the time when he was running for president the second time, and his
30
opponent
1940. No, it couldn't have been.
No.
Been, let's see. Been
No,
1936,
in
sorry.
36.
36, sorry.
He was running against Landon, the governor of Kansas. And you will recall the Kansas state flower is the sunflower, this huge sunflower. And arrangements were made for Roosevelt to come to New Haven to greet his son's father and father-in-law. And because of Roosevelt's difficulty in walking, they built a huge ramp from Everett Street next door to my house through the backyards onto the back porch of Harvey Cushing's home on Whitney Avenue. And
that was for the wheelchair? Or?
No, he wouldn't use a wheelchair. He would attempt to walk on the arm of Jimmy with a cane or a crutch.
Did he do that out of just willpower or in order to create an image of a
Partly
healthy
out of
person?
willpower, but you remember he never really accepted his paralysis. And probably till the day he died, he thought by exercise he would overcome this physical defect. So he kept going to the swimming pool in Georgia, and every opportunity he got, he would try to stand and manipulate to walk with the assistance mostly of Jimmy Roosevelt, his oldest son, and with very little help, including braces and other crutches and things of that sort. Well, Roosevelt was walking, ambling along this ramp from Everett Street along a wooden platform, a slight incline to the back porch of Cushing's house, when the back door swung open and out came Harvey Cushing with a huge sunflower pinned to his jacket. You see, apparently there was already some disagreement among the families, because Cushing prided himself on, at least in that election, being a Republican.
I see. He wasn't just poking fun at or making a joke with.
It was partly in humor, but Cushing had that habit of telling stories about his best friends, poking fun, sometimes with a little malicious intent as well, you know. And I think he thought it would be a great joke to greet the aspiring president for his second term with carrying the insignia of his rival, Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas.
And did President Roosevelt react to it?
He looked at it. I wasn't close enough really to hear whether he had said anything, but I do remember at a distance seeing him, and he sort of grinned, and either he said nothing or he said something that escaped me.
He usually wasn't a man short of words.
No.
In a similar situation, he called Dr. Fulton one time. You mentioned in the meeting that they attended in Bern that Dr. Fulton had received a message of summons to Bucharest.
Oh, yes. At dinner table one evening when I was present, and sitting on Cushing's left, and on the opposite end of the table was John Fulton. There were several other people there. I have forgotten who some of them were. And to poke fun in a good-humored fashion at John Fulton, Cushing turned to me and said, "Harry, do you know that John was decorated last summer in Budapest?" And I said, Bucharest, in the capital of Romania. And I said, "No, I didn't know about it." He said, "You know, we all attended the Congress in Bern, and the messenger came from King Carol of Romania, he of the notorious liaison with Magda Lupescu, who was his girlfriend, and this messenger from the King Carol invited the eminent international scientist to come to Bucharest to be decorated. King Carol will decorate them." So Cushing turned to me and he said, "Now, who do you think would accept an invitation like that?" Of course, John accepted it. He and several other prominent international scientists went to Bucharest. They were admitted to the palace in the early morning hours, and they were waiting the better part of the day for Carol to appear. And finally, in the late afternoon, King Carol did appear. And he had several beautiful red ribbons tied to medallions, one of which he promptly put around the neck of John Fulton, and with a huge bronze medallion hanging down, and he kissed John first on the right cheek and then on the left cheek and departed. And John and the other guests were left standing, and they were told the interview is over. So John wandered out of the palace trying to find the front gate to get back to his hotel, and in wandering through the grounds and looking at the medallion, it was all written in Romanian, which he could not read or understand. So he stopped a gardener who was working on the grass on his knees and said, "My good man, this is all what Harvey Cushing told me. What is this? Can you tell me?" And this man jumped up and clicked his heels. He said, "Why, sir, I have the honor to tell you you've just been decorated with the Order of Chastity, 3rd class." To which John Fulton smiled and blushed a deep crimson, and that was that story.
But you never heard any stories or tales told by Dr. Fulton about Dr. Cushing?
No,
or at least none to his face.
No.
I imagine Dr. Cushing was also very loyal to the doctors he had trained in neurosurgery, from Dr. Davidoff, who I believe is his first.
And he was loyal to John Fulton, too. They were
Yes.
very close and fast friends,
Yeah.
really.
And his relationships with the neurosurgeons from other countries, like Sir Jeffrey Jefferson, you mentioned, and Hugh Cairns had visited, and Norman
Nearly
Lott.
all the people that once trained with him
Yes.
made a point from time to time to come back and visit Cushing at his home, and were well received and entertained, even in the years that Cushing was in New Haven.
I suppose with the exception of Dr. Walter Dandy. I doubt if Dr. Dandy ever came to
No,
New
Dr.
Haven.
Walter Dandy did not come to New Haven.
And Dr. German, in the meantime, did Dr. Cushing participate in any way in helping to form the neurosurgical service at Yale?
No, he gave advice when asked, but to my knowledge, he never went to the operating room in New Haven. Some of his patients who would come on the anniversary of their operative procedure for Cushing to see them, and if they were handicapped and weren't feeling well, they would always write on their anniversary a letter reporting their health status to Cushing. But many patients that he had operated on, sometimes many years ago, 20 and 30 years previously, would come to New Haven on the anniversary of their operative procedure. And I got to meet a good many of them because Cushing would call me and said, "Do you want to see? I took out a meningioma on this patient 30 years ago, and now she's here for a checkup." And I would then go in, and he would introduce me to the patient. He'd do a cursory physical examination and verify that she was doing well. And if they needed another operation, he would usually refer them either to German to do it, or very often to Leo Davidoff, who was then at the time at the Brooklyn Jewish Hospital, of all places. And I remember one patient in particular who was very upset that Cushing wouldn't operate on her, and he explained to her that he no longer operates on patients, but he said, "If I had to have this tumor removed now, I would go to Dr. Davidoff and have it done." He says, I'm sending you to him because I know he will be able to handle it properly."
He was Dr. Cushing's first full resident, I believe, was he not?
I'm not sure that he was the first, but he was one of the early ones.
Maybe related to the length of time that he spent with Dr. Cushing. I'm not certain either.
Well, I am not sure that he was his first resident. I think the service at the Peter Ben Brigham Hospital was already well established. There must have been previous people.
Yes.
No, I'm quite sure there were previous residents, for the reason that Cushing didn't accept Davidoff for training the year he wanted to go, because he already had commitments to other residents. That is the reason why Davidoff went to the North Pole expedition, because there was no room for him in the residency program.
That was with Admiral Byrd.
That's right.
Yeah. But as far as Dr. Cushing's final days in New Haven, had he ever mentioned to you in passing, or did you have any indication he was suffering from coronary artery disease, angina?
Not from coronary artery disease, but I knew in great detail the problem they had with circulation to his toes.
Would he complain of that?
Oh, yes, because he couldn't walk, you know.
No, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes, for a year at a time he was moved by his chauffeur in a wheelchair from his office to the car to his home, because he developed gangrene of his toes.
This was after he moved to New Haven?
Oh, yes.
I
That
see.
was after he moved to New Haven. But he had difficulty, he told me, even before he moved to New Haven.
Yes.
He told me he would tire much more easily in the later years of his life. He couldn't stand up, even when he was at the Peter Ben Brigham. It is one of the reasons why he accepted more or less in good grace his retirement from Peter Ben Brigham, because he felt exhausted at the end of an operation.
Well, he usually sat down for some or most of the procedure.
That is right.
But
course,
he had had that trouble to commence in France.
Yes, which he diagnosed, you remember, as a polyneuritis.
Yes.
Myeloradiculitis and things of that sort. It happened during the First World War,
Yes.
when he was a surgeon with the Harvard unit in France in the Cushing Expeditionary
Yes.
Forces.
Army Base Hospital 5, I believe.
Yes.
Yes.
And he
The Harvard
collapsed
unit.
during an operation and was taken to the hospital. He remained hospitalized for about 3 months in France, and he himself had diagnosed a neuromyelitis.
Yes. It was very rapid in onset, though, in World War I.
Well, in retrospect, it was an incorrect diagnosis,
Yes.
as you know, but all his life, he thought that was the major problem.
Right.
And I know of no neurologist or no neurosurgeon who dared challenge that diagnosis. So everyone accepted it as a fact. The hitch, of course, was, in retrospect, that he collapsed during an operative procedure.
Yes.
And that's not the way neuromyelitis usually acts.
No.
When he began developing his peripheral vascular problems, he was diagnosed by several eminent internists as having Berger's disease.
In New Haven? Or?
In New Haven and in Boston and whomever he consulted. Everyone agreed that he got vascular disease on the basis of thromboarteritis obliterans. And he was even advised to have his toes amputated because of poor circulation.
I'm sure he was advised to give up smoking, too.
Which he refused to do, and he was advised to give up smoking. So he did that, except when the craving got unbearable, he would watch to see that Miss Staunton, the secretary, left the room. And
why was that?
Well, because she was ordered by his physicians and probably by Mrs. Cushing to watch to see that he doesn't smoke. So he'd wait for Miss Staunton to leave the room, and I was present very often in his office when this happened. And he would take out a corncob pipe from his central drawer, fill it with tobacco, light it, and begin to get a few puffs. And then when he would hear Miss Staunton coming back, he would open the door and put his pipe in and leave it like this. And once I was present when Miss Staunton did come in, and there was a smoke ring coming up from the drawer, and Miss Staunton stood and watched it, and she said, "Now, Dr. Cushing, you know you shouldn't do that." And she kept close tabs on him to prevent his smoking.
He must have had angina, too, that maybe he misinterpreted or didn't want to tell anybody about.
To my knowledge, he never complained. He discussed various illnesses with me. Even once he mentioned, he said, "Eventually you may have the opportunity to see if I'm right. You will have to look in the post-central gyrus on the right," because he said, "I've got some peculiar feelings in my fingers of the left hand. There must be some lesion there." As it turned out, at autopsy, I confirmed his diagnosis. He had a small encephalomalacic plaque in the post-central gyrus on the left side.
Now, his terminal illness, the 70th birthday party had been in the spring.
Yeah.
And then this was along in October, was it?
Yes, in the fall.
When he had his final illness.
Yes.
And how were you contacted about this?
Well, he was admitted to the hospital and put in an oxygen tent, and apparently left word that he wanted a post-mortem examination done.
How long was he in the hospital prior to his death?
With the last illness, I don't remember the exact number of days, but it was 1 or 2 days. It wasn't very long.
He had been readmitted several times in the couple of years before?
No, I think John Fulton in his book on Harvey Cushing mentions the episode.
Yes.
But to my knowledge, he never complained of chest pain or any cardiac irregularities.
Right.
So it surprised me and everyone else on the Yale Medical School faculty that he had a coronary attack. But it was obvious that that's what he had because he became cyanotic and he had severe chest pain. He was taken to the hospital, put in an oxygen tent. I saw him through the open door a few hours before he died, and he was cyanotic, and it was obvious he was failing. Whether it was 24 or 48 or even 72 hours in the last admission to the hospital, I don't
So he died of heart failure then, really?
He died of congestive heart failure, oh yes.
And at autopsy, what did you find?
There were a number of very interesting things that was found. The one thing that we clarified once and for all was what it was that he had in 1918, I believe it was, in France when he collapsed during an operation, and which illness that caused his hospitalization for 3 months in France and several months after he came back to Boston, a total of about 6 months when he was incapacitated. And that was due to an embolus which lodged in his aorta and extended from just below the renal arteries to the bifurcation of the iliac arteries. He had no atherosclerosis, by the way, and the embolus had become completely calcified in all the many years that he lived from 1918 to 1939 when he died.
What appeared to be the source of this embolus in retrospect?
Either from an ulcerative plaque with a thrombus in the arch of the aorta, which was the only lesion that we found a healed ulcerated plaque, or he may have had some other source that was never located. At the time I did the autopsy, all we found was the healed-in, calcified occlusion of the abdominal aorta from below the renal arteries to the iliacs. Interestingly enough, below the iliac arteries, he had no atherosclerosis, no other disease at all. The diagnosis of Berger's disease was incorrect.
He must have had some extraordinary collateral circulation.
He developed the collateral circulation, which we demonstrated.
Though he developed the gangrene of the toes, you mentioned.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a complete collateral. It was functional. There were times when he walked around. As a matter of fact, for a year before he died, he attended lectures and attended clinics and participated actively. He traveled a considerable bit without difficulty. But when he overdid things, then he'd begin getting cyanotic, pale, lower extremities.
Yes.
You see. So it was adequate. By the way, surgical amputation wouldn't have solved anything, really. It would have removed the problem that was imminent at the time, but wasn't for a right diagnosis. It wasn't occlusion of the blood vessels in his toes or in his feet that was the trouble. The occlusion was in the abdominal aorta, you see.
Yes. And you mentioned finding a lesion of the brain.
Yes. Then I found this softening in the postcentral gyrus on one side, an old encephalomalacic plaque, which undoubtedly accounted for his symptoms.
Paresthesias.
The paresthesia that he had.
What about, there's been a number of references made to Dr. Cushing having suffered a brain tumor or a colloid cyst of the third ventricle himself, pointing to a paradox there of a neurosurgeon suffering from one of his own lesions that he's treated. But you've mentioned that that is not so. What did you find?
This is an error. Somehow or other, a misconception has risen about what lesion Cushing had in the third ventricle. It was a 3 millimeter in diameter papillary cyst of the choroid plexus in the third ventricle. It was by no means a colloid cyst, nor did it impinge on the foramen of Monroe. There was no evidence of blockage to the outflow of ventricular fluid. He had no hydrocephalus, and I had an illustration made of the lesion at the time of autopsy by the artist at Yale who worked at that time in my department, Mr. Hemberger. And Armand Hemberger made a drawing which I published in Indian Neurology to clarify this thing. It's a minute choroid plexus cyst that he had at that time. That's all he had.
Did he have much arteriosclerosis in the brain, the vessels?
None at all.
None there.
Very little, and except for the arch of the aorta where there was a healed calcified plaque and may have been the source for a thrombus. The rest of his peripheral vessels in the legs and arms were not sclerotic, but he had serious sclerosis of the coronary arteries with occlusion of the anterior descending branch of the left coronary.
Was that the acute lesion that killed him?
That was the acute lesion with a massive hemorrhagic infarct of the myocardium, which was the terminal episode that, of the terminal lesion that accounted for his demise.
Is he buried in New Haven now?
He was cremated.
He was cremated. There was
and
a
where
funeral
the ashes
service,
are, I do not know.
There was a funeral service
yes.
in Yale.
Months later.
Yes.
Yes.
And then as far as his death, that was in 1939.
That's right.
This brings us on to the eve of the war. Going back once again to Professor Spielmeyer, you had mentioned that his wife was Jewish, I believe.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
After his death in 1938 or 1939, since everything had totally changed politically in Germany,
yes.
She and her daughter were left in a very vulnerable position there.
That's
in Munich. You mentioned that she had a sister in England, though, at the time.
She had a sister in England.
Mm-hmm.
And
tell us that story about Mrs. Spielmeyer and the daughter leaving
yes.
Germany.
Mrs. Spielmeyer had my address, and so we were in correspondence. As I mentioned to you, I remained, to the remainder of Spielmeyer's life, a good friend of his and his family. And Mrs. Spielmeyer told me that since Spielmeyer had died, it was progressively more and more difficult for her and Ruth, the daughter, who was a young child of high school age at that time, to remain in Munich, and that she was making plans to go to England to join her sister, who was ill, by the way. They went to England, and they barely got along financially. They had a great deal of difficulty, and finally, Mrs. Spielmeyer, having no other relatives or friends in England, wrote to me and asked if I could possibly arrange to have Ruth come to the United States. And of course, I offered to do it, and that meant providing a visa, which I offered to get for her. And since Alan Gregg, who was the vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and a good friend of Spielmeyer's, and it was through Alan Gregg that the Rockefeller Foundation provided the money to build the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt in Munich, where Spielmeyer was the director. I got in touch with him and told him about the circumstances, and he said, why don't we too sponsor Ruth and we'll provide her with a visa, which I did. And Ruth came to this country as a young girl. And then Alan Gregg got in touch with me. He said, look, you have no children, and I have two daughters, one older and a year older and one about a year younger than Ruth. She'd be probably happier in my household with my daughters than in yours. Of course, you can see her whenever you want, and she'll come to see you, but don't you think it would be a better plan? And I agreed with him, and Ruth was willing to do it. So Ruth joined the Alan Gregg household, and shortly thereafter, she had to go to college. Well, one daughter, the older one, was already in Oberlin in Ohio in college, and it's a good school, and Alan Gregg asked me if I would consent to have Ruth go to Oberlin. And Ruth was willing, so she went there. In the third year, Ruth called me by phone one day and told me she has to come to New Haven to talk to me because she's very unhappy. And the reason she was unhappy was because she told Dr. Gregg that she would like to go to medical school, and he opposed it. And I got in touch with him and asked why, and he said he would oppose it because Ruth had no financial resources of any kind. And who and how would she pay for 4 years of medical school education and 1 or more years of post-medical education training in residency? And I said, but if I can provide that, would you oppose her going? He said, no, but you know, you're undertaking a huge job. I said, I think I know how to solve this. And I went to Wintnitz and said, Ruth is ready to graduate from Oberlin. She's a good student. She wants to go to medical school, but she has no money. I will help her as much as I can if you will accept her in medical school. He said, not only will I accept her to medical school, but after all Spielmeyer did for you and us, we will accept her and she won't have to pay any tuition at all. So Ruth went through the Yale Medical School, got her MD degree, much against Dr. Gregg's advice, but she graduated. Then she, like her father, became interested in psychiatry, and she took residency training in psychiatry after her graduation, and she's a successful psychiatrist in practice in New York City to this very day. Periodically, I hear from Ruth Spielmeyer.
As I recall, and this is some years back, and I may be mistaken about this, and I'm not certain now who it was who may have told me this. It perhaps was you, but as a result of the Nuremberg laws. In 1935, I think, Professor Spielmeyer, by being married to a Jewish woman, was threatened in his academic position, or at least in his position at the
Yes.
Research Institute.
I understand that there's one punishment for his refusal to divorce his wife was for him to stand on street corners and collect money for the Nazi party.
Yes.
And it was during one of those very blustery, wintry days when he contracted pneumonia and subsequently died from the attack of
Yes.
pneumonia.
There's a play by Bertolt Brecht called The Private Life of the Master Race that has been extracted in places, like in New York one time 20 years ago, in Brecht on Brecht, about the dilemma of a man in a similar situation who sort of covertly arranged with his wife to divorce her for those very reasons, to protect himself. I wanted to ask as well now about the entry into the war. You eventually obtained permission to join up, more or less, to serve with the research wing of the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States Navy, enabling you to go to Guam in 1944. And the research that you carried out in Guam has led to a lot of interesting spin-offs over the past, 40 years, I suppose. But what did you discover in Guam? Why Guam first, rather than some other part of the reoccupied islands or the southern hemisphere, say, of the Pacific?
The Navy in the early days of the war, in the 41, 42, organized a unit, a research unit that was called the Naval Medical Research Unit Number 1, that was sent to Africa, because that's where the Americans and the Allies were most engaged in fighting Rommel and his German troops. In 43, the Navy, with the help and interest of the Rockefeller Foundation, decided to organize the Naval Medical Research Unit Number 2, and they appointed the director of the Rockefeller Hospital, Tom Rivers, who was the eminent virologist, to be the commanding officer. And he was made a Commodore, and which title, by the way, the Navy, I think, has in recent years abandoned. There are no more Commodores.
Just the British.
In the United States Navy, there are, so far as I know, there are no more Commodores. And Tom Rivers was asked to organize a unit that would be the counterpart of the Naval Medical Research Unit Number 1 in Africa, to be the Naval Medical Research Unit Number 2 in the Far East. And since Tom Rivers was a virologist, and many of the diseases that we expected to find in the Far East would be of viral origin, it was assumed Tom Rivers was the natural choice. And the Rockefeller Foundation was interested in sponsoring this unit. So they spent a large sum of money refurbishing the unit and establishing a medical library, which was moved from New York to the Far East, and all kinds of equipment. And since we were going to work with virus diseases, and the way to propagate viruses was in the chick embryo, we had a whole flock of chickens, egg-laying chickens, that were part of our unit. We had some monkeys in case we had to use apes and higher animals to transmit disease to. We had dogs and cats and rabbits and mice. Thousands of Swiss mice, for example, were part of our unit. And since we knew we were going to an area where we would not encounter milk and cream, we even had several milk-giving cows as part of our unit. When we finally got mobilized and ready to embark for the Far East, we looked like Noah's Ark with cows and chickens and
you probably had a lot of veterinarians.
and wherever we stopped in the Pacific Ocean at an island, all the natives would come flocking out to see all the animals aboard Noah's Ark, you see. They thought they would establish us somewhere in the Mariana Islands. That was because word came down to us that the Pacific War was gradually moving north towards Japan proper by way of the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, and it was timed that by the time we got anywhere near the Mariana Islands, in which Guam is one of the major islands, we would have recaptured it from the Japanese. Guam was a long time an American base, and the Japanese had captured it and converted it to a Japanese stronghold. And in June of 1944, it was calculated that Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz and his group would reconquer Guam. Wouldn't that be a fine place then to establish on a former American base a new research unit? So the Seabees were ordered to build us an air-conditioned hospital ward and air-conditioned laboratories on Guam if and when we recaptured it from the Japanese. Indeed, while we were in transport from San Francisco north of Truk to the Mariana Islands, and Truk was a stronghold of the Japanese Navy, and which we feared greatly, the Navy and the Seabees and the Army, the American Army, tried to recapture Guam, and indeed they succeeded about 4 days before we were supposed to land. And when we got to Guam, all the city of Agana, which was the capital, was leveled to the ground. Only one building was left standing, which we quickly converted into a hospital for the natives, because there was a lot of pellagra on the island, a lot of hookworm disease, because the Japanese paid no attention to proper nutrition of the native population, the Chamorros of the island of Guam. And the Seabees quickly got busy and built us a modern hospital in Quonset huts and butler huts in the jungle of Guam, at a site where the Japanese Navy had dug in caves, because the island of Guam is made up primarily of coral. And through the coral, they dug caves. We found incomplete meals ready that when the bombardment of the United States Navy finally came to drive the Japanese out, they were in such a hurry to get away, they didn't take much of their equipment. It was all left behind. Many of them got killed, and some of them hid out in the jungle to the very, well, only a couple of years ago, the last Japanese holdout was discovered on the boondock of the island of Guam.
He had become convinced they were not going to win the war?
To the very day that they finally surrendered the last man, years after the war was over, some of the Japanese were still convinced that they would ultimately turn the tide and win the war.
He sounds
That's
like
right.
some of my relatives in the South about the Civil War.
Well, this is the reason why we went to Guam and nowhere else, because that was formerly a stronghold, and we got the wrong information from our Navy sources of intelligence that there would be a lot of schistosomiasis in the Pacific area, and there'd be a lot of tropical disease and viral disease. We found no schistosomiasis, for example, but we found Tsuchigamushi disease, a viral disease. We found
scrub typhus. Yeah.
Scrub typhus. We found an outbreak of Japanese encephalitis. We found hookworm disease rampant, and I wrote several papers. I think the first complete autopsy findings in Japanese encephalitis stemmed from the Naval Medical Research Unit number 2, of which in time I became the commanding officer when Tom Rivers had to go back to the United States.
Well, how long were you on Guam?
Close to 2 years.
Uh-huh. And when did you first notice the neurological condition in the Chamorro Indians?
The Chamorros, the neurological disease you're referring to, the
ALS.
ALS
Mm-hmm.
and Parkinson disease.
Yes.
As the pathologist for the Naval Medical Research Unit number 2, I became the pathologist also to the naval, to the hospital which we salvaged, the one standing building in Agana, and used it for native personnel. Many berry cases were there, a number of wet berry cases, for example, pellagra, because the Japanese were not providing adequate diets for the native Chamorro population, which they captured when they captured Guam from the United States. In consequence, many of the autopsies that I did was on the native population. And I've discovered, to my great surprise, that in one day I did 2 autopsies on 2 native patients with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. In the course of some 5 or 6 months, I had a dozen cases of ALS among natives. And that struck me as very odd for a population of some 28,000 people to have in a 6-month period something like a dozen cases of ALS. So I wrote a report which was sent to the Navy Medical Bureau in Washington, which I understood later they stamped secret and filed away, and everybody forgot about it all through the war. This report of mine was resurrected by Leonard Curlin, who was the epidemiologist long after the war ended, and he discovered that ALS was very common in Guam, so he went out there with a team and confirmed it. And they sent one of my assistants. They wanted me to give up my job at Montefiore, go back to Guam and pursue this finding farther, and I couldn't do it. So I sent a man that I trained, Dr. Hirano, who went and spent 1.5 years on Guam and discovered not only is ALS very common, but Alzheimer's disease is common in people who have ALS, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease, all in one person. And he brought back 30 or 40 brains here for subsequent study, and he wrote this paper, which has since gotten considerable fame for him, on the triad of ALS, Parkinsonism, and Alzheimer's disease, all in one population.
What do you think, or what seems to be the most likely etiology or pathogenesis?
I wish we knew. We always
toy
with the idea that it may be for Alzheimer's disease, still toying with the idea that it may be a slow virus infection.
And
but we have no absolute
ALS
proof for it.
In these people?
And the same holds true for ALS too, you know. Many people still believe that the motor ganglion cells in the cord are destroyed, which is the basis for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, by some slow virus.
Well, similar to scrapie virus?
Similar to, but probably
Right.
not identical
Yes.
with the scrapie.
Yes.
That's right.
And the work continues to this day on the chance finding that you had made in the autopsies that you'd done in the Chamorro Indians there.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, the Parkinson disease that we have found in Guam is probably also not arteriosclerotic Parkinson,
Yes.
but probably the kind that originally
That
in
Parkinson described.
the
Yes.
viral disease that became well understood really at the end of the First World War in Europe.
Yes. As far as your return then to the United States, did you return to Yale initially?
No,
Mm-hmm.
no. When the war was over and I was finally decommissioned, and that was in the middle of 1946, I had an alternative of going back to Yale or accepting a position as chairman of the Department of Pathology at Washington University in St. Louis. I was offered the position, went out to look at it, for example, and decided against it for the reason that in 1946 there was hardly any air conditioning, and St. Louis in July is no place for a New Englander to move to. So I decided that I wouldn't go to Washington University. The president of Montefiore Hospital, which was a private hospital built 100 years ago, and affiliated with Columbia University School of Medicine here in New York, was a man named Henry Moses. And Henry Moses was a very good friend of Tom Rivers. And Henry Moses appealed to Tom Rivers to make a suggestion as to who should be their chief of the laboratory division in Montefiore Hospital. Because during the war, the occupant of the chairmanship of the Department of Pathology at Montefiore was a man named David Marine, the world-renowned scientist who just became shy of winning the Nobel Prize for his discovery of iodine, or lack of iodine, as a cause of colloid goiter. And for age reasons, he was retired in 1943. And until 1946, they had no successor for him. So when the president of this hospital, Henry Moses, approached Tom Rivers for a suggestion, Tom Rivers said, I have a suggestion for you, but I don't know if he will come. Why don't you see if you can get Dr. Zimmerman, who used to be at the Yale Medical School and was my successor in the Naval Medical Research Unit in Guam. He's just coming out of the war. He may be looking for a job, I don't know, but why don't you see him? So I received a call in New Haven, having decided not to go to Washington University School of Medicine and toying with the idea of going back to Yale, but not following it up with great enthusiasm because I sort of felt I had outlived that connection. And Mr. Moses called me on the phone and he said, I'd like to invite you to come to New York to talk with me. I'm a president of Montefiore Hospital, I'm a lawyer, and I would be very glad to talk with you. And I want to tell you that I'm calling you at the recommendation of Tom Rivers, your good friend Tom Rivers. I said, anything Tom Rivers asked me to do, I would try to do. So I came to New York and had a talk with him, and he said, you better go and see the facilities. I went and I was aghast. In my opinion, there were no facilities. They were cobwebs from the ceiling in the laboratory, not in this building, but in another. And I said to Mr. Moses, look, I'm an academic pathologist, not a routine community hospital pathologist. I want to do research, and that's very expensive. So I would need to have a large sum of research money. I would need assistance, and I would need new facilities. This is going to be very expensive for you people. I would suggest to you, you hire somebody else. If you want to, I can name a few people that you might interview. But I don't think that you'd be interested in me. I would be too expensive for you. And Mr. Moses' reaction, which stopped me short in my tracks, was, if you didn't want all of these things, we wouldn't want you. So I said, well, then I need facilities. He said, I will get an architect to work with you and design a new building for you. In the meantime, we will build you 2 Quonset huts in our backyard here to get you working right away. You've worked in Quonset huts before. You just came out of the Navy. I said, that's right. And you tell us how much money you want for equipment, how many people you want to hire for assistants, and let's talk about it. So I drew up a list. In a few weeks, I called him back. I said, it's going to be very expensive. He said, let me tell you off the bat, my predecessor here was a man named Jacob Schiff, the philanthropist, and he left $5 million in escrow at Montefiore, the money of which can only be used by a research worker who's chairman of the Department of Pathology. You can have that money if you want it for equipment and that, if you want to come here. Well, it made it so attractive that I couldn't say no. And so I accepted, and the day I arrived here in October of 1946, they was waiting for me notice that I've been appointed as professor of pathology at the College of Physicians and Surgeons at the Columbia University School of Medicine.
Was that done through the hospital here, or?
No, I knew these people.
I see.
Harry Smith was the chairman of the department.
Mm-hmm.
And among academic pathologists, there was a sort of fraternity. I knew Harry Smith, he knew me, he came to visit me, to welcome me when I finally accepted the job here, and so I felt I was among friends right from the start. I might add that to this very day, I've never regretted making the decision of coming to Montefiore Hospital. A lot of my friends said, this is the death knell of you as a scientist. You'll never be able to overcome that handicap of working in a community hospital. And this wasn't true at all. I've had no problem at all. As a matter of fact, who at my age would be employed full-time in an academic institution?
Yes.
And that's what I am really at this age. I no longer do the administration at my choice, but I have anything that I ever dare ask for, personnel-wise, equipment-wise, space-wise, I get here.
Well, it was a community hospital with a substantial difference from most.
Evidently.
You had mentioned earlier on about Alan Gregg, and Dr. Penfield had been very grateful to him for the support in establishing the Neurological Institute in Montreal, and had written a biography in 1967, I think, The Difficult Art of Giving, the story of Alan Gregg. And it's strange how much involvement Dr. Gregg had in establishing neurosurgery in various places in the world, as well as neurology. He endowed or saw that the Rockefeller Foundation endowed the first chair in neurosurgery in France with Clovis Vincent in 1936 or 37, something like that. About 60 years after the first chair of neurology in the world had been established for Charcot. I don't know whether Dr. Gregg had an orientation towards people he met, or rather towards specialties like the nervous system had a fascination for him. Do you know?
Yes, I know a good deal because I had a good deal of contact with Dr. Gregg subsequent to my experience with Ruth Spielmeyer. I'll tell you about it. The Rockefeller Foundation itself, as you know, would make periodic decisions on what they wanted to sponsor. Nutrition at one time put in a lot of money on people who were working in nutrition. Another time they were interested in the worldwide malaria problem and sponsored that. Basic research, for which they established the Rockefeller Institute here. All of that occupied them. They felt they had to sponsor for which there was a crying need, so that when Kraepelin went to France, to Paris, to talk to Alan Gregg, who was the Rockefeller Foundation representative at that time, and told him that he would like to establish an institute of psychiatry which would emphasize organic aspects of the disease, the Rockefeller Foundation, through Alan Gregg, decided that was a worthy cause. And they put in millions of dollars in the Rockefeller Institute, which they called the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Psychiatrie. Then they decided they would champion medical education, so they gave money for that. In due course, in 1950, I was asked by the president of Yeshiva University here in New York to help organize a medical school in the United States, in New York. The reason was that certain minority groups were unable to gain admission into medical schools. Why, even at Yale, in the years that I was on the selection committee, we're told that we had limitations to the number of Italian students we could admit, to the number of Jewish students we could admit, to the number of women we could admit. And this was universal in medical education in 1950 in the United States, including New York City. There was even an editorial in the New York Times about 1950 by the then dean of Cornell, who was being criticized for restricting admissions of minority groups. And he said this was a private school founded by the philanthropy of white Protestant individuals, and that's what they intend to keep it. So most of their students had to be white Protestants. Well, at that time, there was already a movement afoot to alter this thing. Women were clamoring for admission. Blacks were trying to get into medical school without success. Jewish students were always in abundant supply because it's a tradition among that group of people to study medicine. So I was asked by the president of Yeshiva University to help found the medical school. And I decided that the only way I would participate is if I had in writing a statement from the president and the board of trustees of Yeshiva University indicating that there would be no restriction of admission to the medical school regardless of sex, color, religion, national origin, and that both the student body would be picked on that basis, purely on scholarship basis, and indeed the faculty would be picked that way. And I got that in writing. I still have the document in my possession. They agreed. That led me then to agree to help found the Albert Einstein College of Medicine.
Who first suggested Einstein's name as the person to honor by the name of the college?
I was worried about calling a medical school the Yeshiva University School of Medicine, because I thought nobody would believe me that this was a non-sectarian medical school if we called it Yeshiva University, which is a religious institution. So we agreed, and I appointed 14 members of a board from different parts of the country to help me make decisions of that kind. And we met, and we would meet weekly, periodically, people from the West Coast, from Albany, from Philadelphia, from Chicago, to advise me what to do. And that on one of our meetings, we agreed. One of my members of the board was Dr. Louis Nahum. He was associate professor of physiology at Yale. I knew him very well. And I asked him to serve on the committee. He was a very level-headed man. He was editor-in-chief of Connecticut Medicine, the state journal. And in discussing it with Louis Nahum one day at this meeting that we held, he said, why don't we try to get some prominent man's name for this? And I said, who? And he said, well, a person like Einstein. Well, that stuck in my craw. He didn't know Einstein any more than I. And finally, the more I thought of it, the better I thought the idea was. But since I didn't know Einstein...
Well, did you have to clear this with the committee first, or not?
No, the committee was an advisory committee
I see.
to me. And I appointed them, and therefore I suppose I could have disappointed them if I didn't want their advice. No, I thought it was a good idea, and I thought I would sound out.
Well, how did you
Einstein.
finagle getting his permission to use his name?
Well, at the Yale Medical School, one of my students was a man named Thomas Buckey. And Tom Buckey, who was still in practice in New York, in New Rochelle, was a good friend of mine after he left the student. And he once introduced me to his father, Gustav Buckey, who was originally from Berlin. His mother, by the way, Tom Buckey's mother, was a well-known writer of children's stories. And I met through Tom Buckey his father, Gustav Buckey, who, by the way, invented the Buckey diaphragm that is used in X-ray machines, probably to this day.
Yes.
And I asked Tom if he would ask his father. Tom's father, Gustav Buckey, was a close friend from Berlin days of Albert Einstein. I said, will you ask your father if he would introduce me to Albert Einstein? He said, all right, I'll ask him. About within an hour or so, Gustav Buckey called me. He said, Tom tells me you want to meet Einstein. Is there any special purpose? I said, yes, I'm trying to organize a medical school. And I would like permission from Einstein to use his name. He said, when do you want to see Einstein? I said, when can you arrange it? He said, all right, I'll call you back. Within another hour, he called me back and said, can you come tomorrow? I'll pick you up and I'll take you to Princeton and you'll meet Einstein.
When was this now?
This was in 1950. So on a bitter, cold, gloomy March day, Gustav Buckey with his chauffeur-driven limousine and Mrs. Buckey and Tom Buckey stopped at my house. I lived then on the upper west side of Manhattan. And they picked me up about 9 o'clock in the morning and drove me to Princeton. And when the car stopped, the porch door opened and out ran Einstein without a hat, no necktie, no socks. He rarely wore socks, you know. His shoes matched, but no socks, and a gray sweater with a hole in one of the elbows side, and shook hands with Mrs. Buckey and Gustav Buckey and Tom, and then I was introduced to him, and he invited us all into the house where hot tea was waiting for us. He knew it was a bitter cold day, and we began to talk, and he was a prankster, you know. Among other things, he had a series of eyeglasses, spectacles on his coffee table. And he said to me, pick one up, will you? So I picked one up. He said, put it on. So I put it on. He said, now walk. And they were bit with prisms, so the floor seemed slanted. And as I started walking, I felt I was on a Navy deck, you know, like a soldier, like a sailor would be, which experience I had during the Second World War. I walked slanted like that, and he laughed. He thought it was funny as all get out. And we talked some more, and then ultimately he said to me, my friend Gustav says you want something of me. What is it that you want? I said, Dr. Einstein, we're trying to build a new medical school. He said, another? I said, yes, because we would like to have a medical school that would really mean that they believe that medical students should be admitted on the basis of scholarship alone, regardless of religion, regardless of sex, color, national origin, anything, height, size, so on. He said, that's a very good idea. I said, that's right. So he said, what do you want of me? I said, we would like to name this school the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He was horrified. He looked aghast at me. He said, "Do you know I'm not a physician?" I said, "That's right, but nowadays chemistry and physics and medicine and pharmacology, it's all science. It's all part of medicine. Maybe it's good to have a medical school that won't be all strictly the practice of medicine only, seeing patients." He said, "That's a fairly good idea, but you ought to call it for a doctor." I said, "Well, then I will have to call it the Sir William Osler School of Medicine." He said, "Osler's a famous man. He deserves a medical school in his name, but why pick on an Englishman?" I said, "Well, if we shouldn't pick an English doctor, I'll call it the Joseph Goldberger School of Medicine." He said, "Who is Joseph Goldberger?" I said, "Look, Professor, if I called it the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, do you think anybody would ask me who was Albert Einstein? You know, Joseph Goldberger, by the way, worked for the U.S. Public Health Service, and he did all the work on pellagra in former days. A well-known physician, but not known to many people." So he looked at me, and a twinkle came into his eye, and he turned to his friend Gustav Bucky. He said, "Look, Gustav, you told me Dr. Zimmerman was a physician. He sounds like a lawyer to me." He said, "All right, you may name the school for me." After that, we became fairly good friends. On several occasions, I met him in Princeton again. We invited him to the groundbreaking ceremony in the Bronx here when we built the first building, when we dug ground for the first building. And unfortunately, only a couple of years after the school was built, he did live to see it open, but he died shortly thereafter.
He was a widower, though, at that time you met him?
He was remarried.
Remarried?
He was married to a woman, and he had two sons by her, Hans and another son whose name I don't know because I never knew the son. Never had much to do with Einstein because he sided with his mother. Einstein was divorced from his first wife, had these two sons. Hans remained a loyal son to Albert Einstein, but the other son in Chicago had very little to do with him in his later life. His second wife, who I think was related to him by I think she was a cousin of his, had a child by a former marriage, a daughter, whom Einstein adopted. And so he had 3 children. And I met on all the occasions that I went to Princeton, I met this adopted daughter.
Did any go into the sciences, the physical sciences?
Yes. The Hans Einstein became professor of engineering, hydrology at the University of California in Berkeley. I had a very interesting experience with him one day. His wife was a woman that was a chemist, and I helped her with research money because I was chairman of the research committee of the Multiple Sclerosis Society, and she was working in lipid chemistry. Robot was her name. And Elizabeth applied to the Multiple Sclerosis Society for research grants. She was a bachelor lady at that time, and we gave it to her, and she did some work. Ultimately, when she finished and published her results, she went to California. I did not know that Elizabeth Robas married Hans Einstein.
Mm-hmm.
And I was invited by former students of mine to give a lecture in Berkeley, and I arrived, and one of my students there decided to give a cocktail party for me. And I was sitting, and we were having a drink, and the door opened, and I looked up and was astonished to see Albert Einstein walk into the room. And this man noticed that my jaw dropped. He walked up to me, he said, "You're not seeing ghosts. There's a real reason why I look like Einstein. I'm his son, Hans." He looked just like that, you see, Hans. Hans died a couple of years ago, by the way. Elizabeth Robas is still alive, and she's still working in Berkeley.
This painting of Einstein you have on the wall here that's new, or at least it's new for you, has an interesting history behind it. Maybe you could relate how you acquired it.
This painting was brought to me about a year ago by a Russian refugee physician who worked as an obstetrician in the medical school of Moscow University. And he expressed the desire some 4 or 5 years ago to leave Russia to come to the United States, whereupon immediately he lost his position and had no means of livelihood. He was fired from his academic job. And to his great surprise, some 2 or 3 years later, about a year ago, he suddenly was called in by the Russian diplomatic service and said, "Here's your visa. You, your wife, and your 2 sons must leave Russia within 72 hours." And he came to New York and was taken up by a Russian refugee woman, not a physician, who was running a restaurant. She still has the restaurant on Madison Avenue. And she made a habit of hiring these displaced Russian refugees in her restaurant. If they could cook, they worked in the kitchen. If they couldn't cook, they cleaned the tablecloths. They acted as busboys. This physician who came here a year ago, the obstetrician, got a job through this woman in her restaurant, and he washed dishes at night to make a living in order to exist. And she is a friend of Mrs. Moses, the widow of Henry Moses, about whom I already told you.
Yes.
This woman called Mrs. Moses. She said, "I have a refugee physician from Moscow who needs to pass his examinations and ultimately to practice as an obstetrician. Can you get somebody at Montefiore Hospital to help him?" So of course Mrs. Moses called me, and this man visited me, and I arranged to get him a residency job in obstetrics here. He just completed a residency, took the New York State boards and passed, and now he's an employee of Montefiore on the house staff as a permanent physician in obstetrics with the rank of an instructor. So in gratitude, he came to me a few months ago and brought me this picture. He said, "I know you're a friend, you were a friend of Einstein's. This is a painting done by a well-known Russian artist who had an exhibit in Zurich, Switzerland. And this was among many paintings that were on exhibit. And the last day of his exhibit, he dropped dead from a coronary. So his widow has picked up all the exhibit articles, and instead of going back to Russia, she came to London. And she was a friend of mine, so she gave me this as a memento, and I thought you ought to have it for what you did for me. So he left this with me.
I believe you also mentioned that the artist had never seen Einstein.
That's right. That's right. He did it all from photographs that he saw.
Yes.
Maybe a photograph similar to this, although I haven't seen anybody else with this. Einstein signed it for me and sent it to me the day after we broke ground for the new medical school.
Did he make an address at the opening?
Not
or
at the
breaking
opening,
of the
no.
ground rail?
No, he did not.
Mm.
He was he wouldn't have dared make an address because he always felt that his name was being used under false pretenses. He was not a
Yes.
physician. Every time he'd meet somebody who knew something about the Einstein Medical School, he'd make it perfectly clear that he was not a physician.
He was very sensitive on that issue.
Very sensitive,
Oh.
that's right. He thought he was honored undeservedly.
Mm-hmm.
A very modest man in all reality. You know.
Pasteur was not that way.
No.
The formation of the American Association of Neuropathologists, with your having been more or less the first formal teacher and having the first formal lab in neuropathology in the discipline of pathology itself in the United States. Within just about 25 years or so, there must have been enough neuropathologists to constitute enough to form an organization.
Actually, the American Association of Neuropathologists came into being in the late 30s.
Was it that far back?
Yes.
So the journal
In
didn't
the late
appear
30s.
until...
And by that time, Abner Wolf became a full-time professor of neuropathology at the College of Physicians and Surgeons. He was a member. George Hassan was a member. Nathaniel
Weil.
Winkleman, Arthur Weil, Joe Globus, and I. And we started this association. There was a handful of people who would meet once a year, usually in New York. But once we met in New Haven when I was still at the Yale Medical School. And at that time, Abner Wolf, who was the only other full-time pathologist, was training people. But in reality, more people in neuropathology in this country trained with me than probably with any other single person. For example, as of today, 39 professors or associate professors, a number of them chairmen of departments, are in neuropathology and were trained by me in the United States alone. There are 77 in Japan. The American Association of Neuropathologists has grown from this handful of people in the late 1930s to about 600 members at the present time. Not all of them are neuropathologists. They have a neuropathology interest, but a few of them are neurosurgeons who do neuropathology as a hobby. A few of them are neurobiochemists, a few neurophysiologists, and so forth. But because I trained so many people in Japan, there are 77 full-time professors and associate professors in Japan. They started first as a Harry Zimmerman Association of Neuropathologists, very much like they started the Harvey Cushing Neurosurgical Society. Now it's grown, so it's twice the size of the American Association of Neuropathologists. There are well over 1,200 members in neuropathology in Japan, so that they too have changed it, and I think properly, to the Japanese Association of Neuropathologists, and I'm an honorary member of that organization. So worldwide, I think they added up now, there are 139 professors of neuropathology whom I have trained, including some in South America, and the 3 leading neuropathologists in France, for example, were trained by me. Dr. Brion, Dr. Laprelle, and Dr. Hassoun. They, in turn, have trained other neuropathologists in France, so that, to my great amusement one day, at the occasion of the meeting of the International Society of Neuropathologists, which was held in Budapest, at the banquet, my wife sitting next to me was approached by a young man who said, Dr. Zimmerman, I want to introduce myself to you. I'm your grandson. And my wife turned to me, she said, since when? And he explained how that he's my grandson because I had trained Dr. Brion, and Dr. Brion had trained Dr. Marchand, and Dr. Marchand had trained him. So he's my grandson.
In neurosurgery, we tend to do that too, I think.
Yeah, I suppose.
You're a member of the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, I believe. Are you not?
Yes, I am.
And also you're on the editorial board of surgical neurology.
That's right.
So you've had a lot of contacts with neurosurgeons over the years as well.
Oh, yes.
And trained them in neuropathology for intervals of time they've come and spent here. Like Dr. Busey's residency program often included a year, or many years included a year here for the residents. As compared to the way it was when you entered pathology and became exposed particularly to neuropathology. And today, what are the most outstanding differences that you can think of, other than the technology itself? The state of
Well,
knowledge.
as you probably know, in the last several years, most of the advances that have been made in medicine have been in the neuroscience areas. If you stop to realize that the weekly journal Science, which arrives for several years now, it has interested me to look at the scientific articles in Science to discover that between a third and sometimes as many as